Good morning, everyone. I'm Dana White. Stepping aside from my usual role as host of the Myth Salon, it is my honor to bring together three of our contemporary culture's great minds today to explore the wisdom and relevance of Michael Gellert's new book, Legacy of Darkness and Light, Our Cultural Icons and Their God Complex. Today, we have with us Dr. Lionel Corbett, the author of The Religious Function of the Psyche, Psyche and the Sacred, The God Image, Understanding Evil, and Spirituality Beyond Religion. A Jungian analyst, Dr. Corbett is a professor at the Pacifica Graduate Institute teaching depth psychology. His 9-part series of talks on YouTube that I co-produced in 2020 at the start of the pandemic continues to rank among the most popular videos on my YouTube channel. Dr. Gard Jameson is also a featured participant in this 9-part video series with Dr. Corbett. I continue to enjoy a more than 20-year personal collaboration with Gard, editing and designing 4 of the books he has authored. The 3-part Story of Our Mythic Moment, Phaethon, Ramayana, and Monkey, and most recently, The Peace Pilgrim Pictures, a contemplative journey with Nicholas and Elena Roerich. Michael Gellert is a Jungian analyst practicing in Los Angeles. He has served as the director of training at the Jung Institute in LA. He is the author of Modern Mysticism, The Way of the Small, Far from This Land, America's Identity Crisis, and The Divine Mind, these last 2 each winning the prestigious Nautilus Book Award. It is an honor to bring Michael Gellert today, together with Dr. Lionel Corbett and Dr. Gard Jameson, in conversation about Michael's latest book, Legacy of Darkness and Light, Our Cultural Icons and Their God Complex. So let's begin our journey together. There are profound parallels among the passions driving each of you to articulate the archetypal nature of the human psyche in the books that you have created. I am deeply privileged to host this presentation, and I look forward to experiencing what our conversation will bring forth. So, may I turn to you first, Lionel?
Yeah, thank you, Dana. I thought you made a good point when you talked about the passions that drive us to write these kind of books. There is a kind of urgency, which I can really detect in Michael's recent book. I thought I'd like to begin by asking him what was moving him to write a book like this.
Thank you for the question, Lionel, and thank you for presenting this series and inviting me to participate in the first one. This book was originally a larger book that, due to the publishing requirements, I broke into 2 books. The first is The Divine Mind, and then this one. This one is really looking at what Jung initially called the Yahweh complex. I've, in my research, found all kinds of material that Jung didn't have access to. And that changed my perspective of the biblical God, the God of the Old Testament. The book is primarily about the God complex, the chief God complex of Western and Islamic civilization, going back to the beginning with Abraham, the patriarch. Now, most people today, when they hear the term Yahweh complex or God complex, the Yahweh complex is a form of the God complex, but distinct to the Abrahamic traditions, namely all of us in the West and in Islamic countries. Most people think that the God complex is when somebody thinks they're God, and of course, they're not. What this complex shows is that people do not have that complex the way, the God complex, the way one thinks of it in popular culture. somebody in one of the universities on the East Coast did a study bringing together patients, psychotic patients, who all thought that they were God, and they wanted to see how this group therapy would go. Well, it didn't go very far because they all argued amongst each other, who is God? Who is the real God? The Yahweh complex in particular is a complex that the person doesn't necessarily know they even have it. And even if one does not believe in the biblical God, the attitudes and the emotional style and the behaviors of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible are what most characterize this complex. And the book is about that, looking at a variety of icons in our culture whom express what this complex looks like when it's constellated. It's an archetypal complex from the unconscious. And whether someone even believes in the biblical God or not makes no difference. We're all susceptible to it because it's an archetypal complex that comes from our collective unconscious. We're inherited. We inherited that disposition and carry it in our own collective unconscious, whether we believe in God or not. So it looks at these iconic figures that one would not necessarily think they have a God complex, but upon closer look, we see that they do. And the book is basically an overview of varieties of the Yahweh complex.
Would you agree that what you're calling the Yahweh complex or the God complex is analogous or very similar to what we could also call a severe narcissistic personality disorder? You know, it seems that if you look at the God image in the Hebrew Bible, he has many features of a narcissistic personality, you know, with the demand for mirroring, the exclusion of all other gods, the sense that he's the most important God, and attacks of rage if he's disobeyed. All these are, you could even say he looks like a borderline personality. He certainly looks like a sort of narcissist. So is what you're talking about a sort of archetypal way of talking about a narcissistic character disorder? Someone who's inflated and grandiose and full of self-importance and so on.
Well, that is definitely the characteristics of somebody who has a Yahweh complex, and that complex is constellated in their behavior. Jung himself made a point in answer to Job to point to the narcissistic nature of Yahweh. He didn't use that word because narcissistic personality disorder as a term, psychiatric term, wasn't yet in vogue. Jung basically says that Yahweh was himself unaware of how self-preoccupied he was. Mm-hmm. And that is about as close as he gets to talking about the narcissism of this complex. The one difference, Lionel, that distinguishes it from narcissistic personality disorder is the fact that everybody who has a Yahweh complex, which is almost all of us in the West and in Islam, when the complex is triggered, we behave narcissistically. So the Yahweh complex is almost always narcissistic. But narcissists in general do not always have a Yahweh complex. That needs to be distinguished. There are a lot of people walking around who are narcissistic, but they don't necessarily exhibit this rage and this entitlement above all others. They don't necessarily carry those features. So that's the one distinction. But they
do feel very special and entitled. The other thing that I'd like to ask you is about the origin of this complex, the source of it. I mean, we normally say that people who are very inflated and grandiose are often defending against internal feelings of shame and worthlessness, and that the complex is an attempt to compensate so that they don't need to feel their sense of inferiority. And in that sense, it's a defense. Do you think that's one source of this, or do you think it's an identification with the self, the capital S self, or do you think it's due to a failure of tempering, of infantile grandiosity? What are your ideas about the origins of this? Why is it so prominent in our politicians, for example, and in political leaders? Where does it come from in their development?
Well, you're right. The source of it is actually goes back to the period of the Hebrew Bible, where this biblical God was amalgamating all the features of all the gods of the Near East. The difference being that all the other cultures in the ancient world had each god had a different function, captured a different piece of human experience. And with the rise of monotheism, all those different gods and qualities got merged into this one monotheistic God. So our susceptibility to this complex goes all the way back to the times of the Hebrew Bible. It grew together with, as you pointed out, the sense of the deeper self. And as you pointed out, there's no way to really tell where the experience of God and the experience of self, where one begins and the other ends. So they kind of get merged together. But this complex is really a modern way, psychological way of talking about the experience of Yahweh that the ancient Israelites had. And it goes back to that period. It's changed over the decades and the years and the millennia, but it is essentially a recapitulation, so to speak, of the experience the Israelites had with Yahweh.
But it must have developmental origins, because we don't all have that problem. So what is it about the individuals, terribly grandiose politicians and so on, or, sometimes you see it in CEOs of corporations that make them feel very important and very special and entitled.
Yeah.
What is it about them developmentally which produces this? I mean, most of them probably haven't read the Bible, actually.
Yeah.
So this is, maybe God would have, we should introduce your ideas about this.
I have a brother who is the head of YPO International, which is all the young bucks who run all the corporations. And there seems to be a character trait that many of them share, which is this need to exert power and this sense that their identity is connected to their capacity to exert power. Living in Las Vegas, we had a local casino owner who will go unnamed, but his name is on a couple of casinos here. And his way of managing was basically to scream at people. And
well, the need for power is actually a psychopathic trait.
Yeah.
It's the need to control people, but it's rooted in a feeling of terror that unless I'm in charge, I'm going to be prey. I want to be a predator rather than prey, so I better be in charge of everything so that to be safe.
Yeah, it goes back to that
question. And
question.
that's certainly also part of the Yahweh complex, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at people's personal development, you could usually see the seeds of Yahwism, that trauma is so central a part of the Hebrew Bible experience.
Yeah.
Shows that there's a correlation between what the people are going through and this appearance of Yahweh with all his inflated qualities. The studies now today, actually, a lot of the neuropsychological studies with people who suffer from narcissism, or as you pointed out earlier, Lionel, a borderline personality, there seems to be a genetic or some primary component that is there to begin with from the person's birth, and then it gets, of course, manifest as they grow older. The fact that a lot of these folks have trauma in their history, and it's hard, of course, again, to figure out where trauma ends and the natural Yahweh complex begins. It's clear that there's a developmental trigger. And when you read the Bible carefully, you could see that Yahweh himself was traumatized. And that comes up in a variety of places in the Hebrew Bible, but underscores it from beginning to end. So you're right about that.
Perhaps we should acknowledge that we're looking at the Bible as from a psychological point of view. We're assuming that the authors of the Bible were projecting human personality traits onto their image of God. So that when we talk about narcissism and borderline personality, we're not talking about the divine itself. We're talking about the way these authors of the Bible portrayed their image of God, right? They projected their notion of God, their own human psychological traits onto their God image. Only fundamentalists take it all very literally.
Yes, that's definitely there. But there's something that Yahweh has, some quality, some distinct identity he has that doesn't actually easily parallel itself in the experiences of the people. It seems to come from what we inherit, which is an archetype prone to the Yahweh complex. You could call it the Yahweh archetype, as some people have called it. That seems to be there with people who are narcissistic and borderline too. You definitely see, for example, in these young people who go on shooting sprees. There was just another one this weekend in Jacksonville. Where exactly their narcissistic experience and their borderline tendencies come from, it can be traced to trauma in their earlier lives, but the Yahweh complex is there from birth. And when it gets constellated, it goes through the person and merges with their narcissistic or traumatized history. And then it comes out as the behavior of a god, to think that they can go in and murder whom they want. This is an experience of Yahweh as well. So the Yahweh complex is fueled by our developmental inheritances, and at the same time fuels it and brings in other components.
When you see
you feel that trauma is something that is located within our personal biography, or is it intergenerational? Is it genetic? I know Thomas Hubble and several people have suggested that trauma is not just something that is personal or collective in our personal biography, but it's something that's actually carried genetically. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not a neuropsychologist, and I go with that idea because so much of our talents, like with musical instruments, the people who have these gifts are different ways the genes come together to create that talent. And I think the disposition toward this condition we're talking about today is somewhat similar. That is why astrology charts so often work for people in that very revealing way. It pinpoints the inherited origin of their problems. And that actually helps people because it objectifies the condition and shifts it out of the place of blame or self-blame and allows them to work on it responsibly, and I use the word responsibly with responsibility. It's the responsibility, the ability to respond to what is ailing us. So these findings I think, are very important that are going on in neuropsychology.
So maybe we should say, in case there are any sort of dedicated religionists watching this, that we're looking at the biblical text as a mythic text. We're not looking at it as a literal depiction of divinity. We're looking at it as the human projections onto divinity. And I think this is part of a much larger project, because as the Judeo-Christian tradition since the Enlightenment has been fading in importance, and its hold on people has been lessening, we need to either re-mythologize the tradition or find some other way of thinking about it. I think that was partly Jung's project, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So at the University of Nevada, I will tell you, virtually all of my students will say, I'm spiritual, but not religious.
Not religious, yeah. So, and that was Jung's notion, was beginning in the Red Book, that a new God image is emerging in the psyche with the loss of importance of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Something new is emerging. And von Franz points out that when that happens, that we look at the old tradition from a mythic point of view instead of looking at it literally. It has spiritual importance, psychological importance, but it's not literal history anymore.
Yes, I think it was Jack Miles who said that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is myth looking for history, and the New Testament is history looking for a myth. What I think is, for me at least, has been very helpful as a way to move beyond the Yahweh complex, both mythically and historically, is the experience of the mystics. And here you see all three Abrahamic religions come together, having a similar experience of the divine. In the Jewish tradition, that took shape with the Kabbalah and the Kabbalists, the medieval rabbis, who had a religious experience, a numinous experience that was so profound and beyond what people were having before they came on the scene. People who lived in the cultures that the three traditions they had to give God a completely different name. So different was the God of the mystics than the mythological Yahweh. And the same thing happened also in Christianity with the Christian mystics in the Middle Ages, and then with the Sufis who came on the scene at the same time as well. Those three traditions, if we see them side by side, we can't always tell which one is speaking because so similar is their experience. It almost seems to transcend mythology and the mythic, although of course it's a new myth as well. And I imagine that what Jung talked about is the coming of the new God image, and he said in his day that he estimates that it will take about 600 years, and that we're working on the foundations of that now. Which is why we're in such crisis all the time. We just have to turn on the news and we see how we're completely falling out of the old container, the old mythic religious container. Unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that the mystics of the three Abrahamic religions didn't get enough exposure to become truly integrated in our culture. And people don't even know what Judaism, Christianity, and Islam evolved into in those
Well, that's the value of
mystical
Jung,
traditions.
because his idea is that all the religious experience emerges from this mythopoetic level of the psyche, the deep level of the psyche.
Exactly.
The problem is the traditions don't really trust their mystics, because you can have a numinous experience that emerges from the depth of the psyche that contradicts traditional doctrine and dogma. So you have to be, if you're in a tradition and you have a mystical experience, you have to be careful and either not to talk about it if it's not orthodox. We know the story of Nicholas of Fleury, who had a mystical vision of the face of Christ that was so frightening that his confessors were afraid that if he talked about it, the Inquisition would get to him. So they had to convert it into a benign image of the Trinity. And so the mystics, somebody said, I think it was Jung who said, you can't Christianize the unconscious. It'll produce whatever it produces. So that's partly why mystics are not listened to. The priesthood, in all the traditions, has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. They don't want any new stuff.
Can you imagine what it was like for Jung being a young boy
Oh,
and
yeah.
having the vision of the church up in the sky,
Yeah.
dropping a turd on the church?
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
Yeah, and considering that his father was a priest and his grandfather was a Protestant pastor and multi-generational
Yeah, of course,
representatives
the psychoanalysts go to town on that. They say it's a repudiation, an Oedipal repudiation of his father's tradition.
Yes.
Well, that doesn't necessarily contradict the mystical interpretation. You can have both.
No, it doesn't.
These things come together. That's an example of the developmental and the archetypal coming together in his experience.
To illustrate your point, Michael, I just returned from the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and I was there for the second, which was in 1993. And there you would see the likes of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and Wayne Teasdale, who was a Christian Hindu crossover, and a variety of mystics. And you would see the quality of their community, and you would recognize there's something here that transcends the boundaries of the institutions, as you're pointing out. And at this latest one, they had the three interfaith amigos who are friends of mine. One is a Sufi from Bangladesh, the other is a Christian mystic, and the other teaches at the Vancouver School of Theology, and I might suggest she's a mystic as well. And when they gather, there's nothing but an amiable friendship, a sense of community. And I think this is what people are craving, and why the Yahweh complex is really a difficult one right now, because it's found its way into our politics, into our economy, into our social structures in a way that is dividing us and crushing our environment and crushing our human spirit. So how do we find our way out of this hole? My father used to say the rule of holes is when you're in one, stop digging. How do we find our way out of this hole?
Well, one way is actually going deep enough into the experience to flip to its opposite internal side, which is the positive Yahweh complex. You mentioned Desmond Tutu. Nelson Mandela himself was raised not only with his particular village's tradition that he came from, but by being a student in a Methodist school. His mother wanted him to get a good education. And he spoke about that in such a way that he was able to pull out of that school experience the wisdom of Christianity. And he himself constellated very much the positive Yahweh complex. How does one spend 27 years in a prison and not break down? He relied very much on, as he himself expressed, the positive side of the biblical God. So you get that with great figures in Legacy of Darkness and Light. I go through these various icons, including Martin Luther King and Churchill and Abraham Lincoln. you get these figures who, within the tradition, although Lincoln was himself beyond the tradition as well, he had two sides because he questioned his own belief system. But essentially, those who can ride with that archetypal complex long enough for it to flip into its opposite and to work it in their souls, that could be a very positive addition to our current problems and also to the future God image that we're building. On the other hand, a lot of those folks whom you described as saying, I'm spiritual but not religious, they're probably going to be headed in a direction that is not bounded by a single tradition. It seems that building, that erect divine structure that Jung felt we're slowly building one generation at a time, itself will be syncretic. We'll have a lot of different traditions contributing it. Jung himself brought alchemy and astrology and even yoga meditation out of the woodwork for Westerners and showed how each of these together can create a very rich experience. So I think it's going to go in a way that allows everybody to practice the way the psyche is calling them. I think if we think of that 600-year temple that Jung felt we are building, it'll look something like that.
But I don't think we've really gone into God's question enough about what do we do with this in the culture, because these malignant narcissists are very, very dangerous when they have nuclear weapons, as we know.
That's right.
And people idealize them. I mean, even Hitler was idealized at in the early part of the war. And even now we have contemporary politicians who are obviously malignant narcissists who are massively idealized.
Yeah.
So we have to try to understand why people idealize characters like that.
I think part of it is exposing what you both said, which is the mythic dimensions of our scriptures, and exposing the reality of, did God really negotiate with the devil in the book of Job? Did God really want Isaac murdered? I think there's too little of that conversation going on. And there's a wonderful book called The Four Americas, and a study of 5,000 Christians, and 73% of those surveyed said God is critical, authoritative, and distant. And I tell my students in my philosophy course, I'm an atheist when it comes to that God.
But that's the projection of human character traits, usually parental character traits, isn't it?
But it's finding its way into our politicians, into our policies, into our economics. And it's as you say, in the current moment, it is a time bomb. It is an Oppenheimer moment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what it brings up is the apocalypse archetype, which is a close cousin to the Yahweh complex. You don't get the Yahweh complex more or less in all the three main traditions of the West and Islam. You don't get the God experience without the apocalypse. And Jung has a line somewhere where he says that the apocalypse is a unavoidable experience and a necessary transformer from one paradigm to the other. When we think about that, it has huge implications for how exactly, as you point out, Gard, how we approach the mythical and how we deal, as Lionel, you were commenting, with these folks who are so deep in the Yahweh complex that how do we get them to begin to think about Yahweh and the Hebrew Bible as a symbolic document, not as a literal. I think we're so entrenched in this that it almost seems like we need to have an apocalypse to break through. Now, Maimonides in the Talmud said that he believes the apocalypse will be a very positive experience and doesn't necessarily have to have this horrible, terrible end of the world 1,000-year peace followed by the war in the Book of Revelations.
But the apocalypse that's an example of the human need for a reparative fantasy where all evils will be conquered and everything will be made right, and there'll be a new beginning. I mean, these are human wishes and desires. They're not. That also can't be taken literally.
Well,
Yeah,
a fantasy that arises out of human psychology.
Right.
Marie-Louise von Franz said that Jung had his own visions of a vast devastation that would not inflame the whole planet, but would be planetary in nature, and that he had a sense that this was sort of an impending situation. I had hoped that the pandemic might have been that moment, but it appears that most people have come out of that moment with a similar quality of unconsciousness that they had when they went in.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to tell if the archetypal experience of the end of the world will actually happen in this concrete way. It could happen in a more subtle way, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean the end of the world, literally. Thank goodness.
The world as we
I have
know
to
it.
admit that as time goes on, I'm getting myself more and more discouraged in believing we do need to go through this transformation, because it'll take that to break its hold on us, as you were saying, Lionel.
Well, the world as we know it might come to an end, but
the world as we know it.
That doesn't mean literal nuclear destruction.
That's right. It doesn't necessarily have to, and we hope it doesn't take that form.
Yeah.
That there has to be a major transformation, and that it might take centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Is a more symbolic way of looking at the apocalypse. The very word apocalypse in Greek means the end of an era, or the end of our age.
Well, we are beginning a new era. It's the end of the Christian era.
That's right.
It's analogous to the end of the pagan era when Christianity began. This is now the beginning of a new era altogether, I think. The post.
Whenever you're in that place of transition.
Yeah, it's a liminal period.
Era,
that's the dangerous period. Yeah.
That's right, because we're not yet out of the old, and the new has not quite yet been born. We're sort of shuffling between them. This could be, astrologers say, a 50 to 150 year transition.
Yeah, it's a liminal period.
Yeah. To me, the hopefully what might come from that transformation, violent or not, is an experience of God which is godless with a small g, or maybe with a big G, if we think of it as the God of the Hebrew Bible. I think the mystics were pointing in the right direction when they said the God that can be spoken of is not the real God. I think St. Augustine said that. Or the notion that I am God and you are God, and God is as the saying goes, God is the center of everything, and the boundaries of whom are nowhere.
Don't you think Jung's notion of the self as the God within is a reasonable alternative, because it can manifest itself in a wide range of ways that could accommodate everybody without insisting on one symbol like the cross? The self can appear in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, and I think the emergence of that in the experience of individuals is what will help us carry it forward. I
But
don't
that
know if
raises the
I
issue
don't
of
know
why
if it.
people don't know about it. They're looking for some kind of new spirituality, but they don't know about Jung and the notion of the self.
Well, Jung himself felt that his works would eventually go into the dark ages he felt we were heading into, and himself felt melancholic about the future and the future of his writings. Will they be read in the future, and will they be understood? Still, people don't understand Jung, and he's was way ahead of his time. I don't know if it'll take the form of using literally the language that Jung used or that the mystics use, the self, but in some way or other, I think it's the only direction we have to go in. And I keep it in a kind of a broad format.
But Jung is avoided in most universities. There are very few universities teach.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I remember when Joseph Campbell was giving a talk at St. John the Divine, there was a Catholic priest sitting next to a friend of mine, and Campbell was talking about the God within, Lionel. Mm-hmm. Catholic priest leaned over to my friend and said, "That is blasphemy."
Well, not I, but Christ lives in me. What's blasphemous about that? I think somebody said that, didn't they?
I understand. Sometimes take him back to the seminary and have him read a little bit. But that's the point of view, and it's a point of view of narcissism within the institutions of self-protection, creating exclusion so that we can save ourselves. So really,
that attitude is that it's all out there in the Bible and in the church. There's nothing in here. It's a terrible point of view.
Well, we have to be careful with all these names as we go forward and how they change. The word God, the word love, the word evil, these are ancient words. And they point to primordial experiences. Some way or another, we've got to get out of the prison of language and of abstract concepts and theological dogma. Again, I think of the mystics of the three traditions in the Middle Ages. They talked regularly with each other. When the Islamic Empire was, the Islamic Enlightenment was happening in the world of Islam and in Europe, and the Christians and the Jews were going through their version of it. Those three traditions, the great leaders of them, were always talking with each other and saw eye to eye.
Yeah, but they were also killing each other.
People in their own religions who were persecuting them. So you find that problem of how to connect to the divine in a way that doesn't get into the polemics of dogma and yet mean something to people. Self is a good word. It also raises questions because the self itself is a concept that has polarity. Jung's notion of the self was somewhat different than the way the Vedanta masters and the Tibetan Buddhists talk about the self, or as the Buddhists would call it, the no self, because they wanted to discard any qualities we could give him. So you call him no mind or no self. It right away keeps the fluid quality alive. How we're going to get that integrated into our culture is anybody's good guess.
I think, you're both calling for a deep personal spiritual experience, too deep for words. Meister Eckhart said, "God saved me from God."
Right.
And he was somebody who really delved into the depths of the psyche.
Yeah, but look what happened to him. He got into trouble.
Got him into big trouble. Al-Hammam, the Sufi, said, "I am God." That got him killed.
Yeah.
Right.
So this call to personal spiritual awakening and a personal spiritual experience too deep for words, I think, is the call of the moment. And it does move beyond concept. I remember Jung, toward the end of his life, was reading a Buddhist text, and he remarked, "This man got it."
Right.
This man got it.
That was a Zen Buddhist he was talking about.
So here we are in this pivotal moment, and not knowing which way to look. But I'm curious, Michael, for yourself, is there a practice or is there a way in which you move to those kinds of depths? And you too, Lionel, how do you find awe or the numinous in your own personal experience? I'm curious.
Well, you look at your dreams and synchronistic events and your complexes, and you do that kind of inner work. I mean, all that is spiritual practice now.
Yeah.
You don't have to do it. If you look at the Bible, you're looking at what William James called second-hand religion. That's all about what happened to somebody else.
I believe in the notion of what all the great leaders and masters of the world's religious traditions talk about, sometimes in their own way, but in a way that's pretty common, is the notion of grace. That the Enlightenment experience and the experience of God within ourselves is an experience of grace. It's almost like an accident. My first Zen teacher said that enlightenment is grace. And all that the meditation does for you is it makes you open to that. It's like an experience of a breeze going by your window. You need to open it for the breeze to come in. Meditation, prayer for those whom it works.
Would you agree with me that this current interest in psychedelics is an opening to the numinous that's going to lead to a new form of spirituality? I don't think it's an accident that everybody nowadays is interested in psychedelics, and because that's one of the ways that you open the window. The trouble is you can open it a bit too wide at times, but in principle, you mentioned Houston Smith. Didn't he coin the term entheogen? The substance that reveals the divine within, or something like that.
He also said, be careful. Once you've got through the door, don't attach yourself or don't hold on to the door handle for too long. So I think he was pointing to the fact that we have a lot of those substances like DMT, melatonin, dopamine. We have those substances within us. And so how do we unlock those? That's the interesting.
Well, we have to learn to use them properly, which is what a lot of the current research is all about. But I don't think it's an accident that they've appeared in the West now. Of course, they've been used in indigenous traditions for a very long time.
And it was very much what the 60s were about, Ram Dass and Timothy Leary. They initially wanted to do research and apply the use of these substances to help people exactly what we're talking about today, to have an authentic God experience that unites us rather than divides us.
But the church
of course, the government clamped that down, and now we're getting a reemergence of that. And it's curious that goes very well with the work that the neuropsychologists are doing, because it cuts beyond verbal dichotomies and allows for the oneness of everything to emerge.
The church is
my experience of a lot of the young people coming to do analytic work is that they've gone on an ayahuasca journey and they have this profound opening, but they don't know what to do with it. And they don't exactly know what it means. So they then come to the Jungian analyst, who helps them explore it as if it were a dream, because it comes from the same place that dreams do. So it's definitely in vogue now, and I think we're dealing with it more responsibly than we did during the 60s. And I think we're increasingly going to see the use of these mind-altering substances in therapy in general. So yes, I think what you said, Lionel, that Jung is not taught in the universities, but in the different programs like what's going on with this research, he'll be creeping in unavoidably.
Yeah, because he helps us to understand and integrate the content of the psychedelic experience.
Exactly.
He's one of the main, although it's very interesting that Jung himself didn't approve of the use of psychedelics.
Right, right. And his
Because
fellow citizen.
he was worried about this problem of integration. How do you deal with the material that emerges?
Perhaps he'd seen what cocaine had done to Freud.
Yeah, that's right. But the churches will resist this revolution because the material that emerges doesn't conform to traditional doctrine and dogma.
Yeah.
And the culture as a whole has a big investment in the ego, and these agents dissolve the ego. So that's another source of resistance.
It's a threat. You mentioned Ram Dass, Michael. You know, it's interesting the counter he had with his teacher, Neem Karoli Baba. And when he had given him the sacred mushrooms, he thought it was just the first course of a 3-course meal. It had no effect upon his psyche.
Right.
And again, suggesting that all of these qualities, all of these substances are already contained within the human body. It is a question of how do we release it? So again, it's that question of is it out there or is it in here? Maybe it's both.
Well, the notion of grace, or that this kind of experience is an accident. Also, one of my early Buddhist teachers said, enlightenment is an accident, and with all the things we use to have it, like drugs and meditation and prayer, makes us accident prone. That's all that they do. And that's all that we need. We need to be open to the accidental, synchronistic way almost these things are coming together. You know, John Lennon always discounted what people were asking him about his song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Everybody said, well, this is definitely going to be the next national anthem for the movement of awakening in the 60s. And he said that it wasn't that. It was my son was drawing a cartoon or a painting or on the floor, and I asked him, looking over his shoulder, about it, and he said, no, that's nothing to do with any. It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And that's the way the unconscious works, that the purveyor of it, the ego, or John Lennon, didn't think that it had anything to do with LSD, but it did. It was just happening on a synchronistic level. Toynbee said that the new civilization coming, for it to be viable, it needs to internalize the best features of the civilization that is passing. So these things, like the research with mind-altering substances, I think are part of that.
Yeah, it comes back to, for me, I just read a book called Awe by Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley. And it reminded me so much, Lionel, of your book on the religious function of the psyche, and Jung's comment that it really is only the numinous that releases us from the curse of pathology. And it seems like with the mental health issues that we're facing in this current moment, you know, there's a requirement for a deeper exploration of how do we cultivate the numinous, or awe or wonder, in our lives in a way that's permanent, not just every 10 years or every time we have a sacred dream, but it's always there. And so I'm curious, both of you, how do you cultivate that seed on a daily basis? I know with your dreams you do it, but how else do you approach it?
Well, I'm tempted to say microdosing helps. But I think the dream work is really core. Don't you agree, Michael? It's essential.
I do.
The difficulty is, of course, that dreams are very difficult to understand sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy path.
Yeah. Freud said that every dream has a navel, or a belly button, which can never be analyzed and understood. It's eternally mystical.
I had the dream of going back to school so many times. I finally went to Pacifica Graduate Institute. And when I got there, I told my brother, I think I need to pay more tuition. This is really too much fun, which was an indication that my dreams had worked.
Right. Right. Yeah.
We began this talk today with malignant narcissists. And it seemed to me that as we were looking at that, we were looking at people who were dissociated from their environment, from their culture. They were doing things without the backing or the aegis of the community that they considered themselves to be serving. Is America in a similar position today? Are we serving the entire world or humanity or existence itself through the kinds of actions that we promulgate on an international or on a global level?
Who is the we in that question?
Well, we're part of a culture, and to the extent that we buy into whatever the culture is, that's us doing it. So
resistance within a culture, Dana, always has to be. World War II, the resistance fighters were the moral heroes of the moment. And the moment is calling for more moral heroes. And I think awe and wonder and numinosity draws out that quality of courage and compassion and wisdom.
Each of us has the crisis of consciousness on a moment by moment basis. And whatever we do to bring it forth, when you talk, for example, about Bob Dylan or John Lennon or the Rolling Stones or Marilyn Monroe, often the problems that they felt, and you use them as examples of the Yahweh complex, I don't think that Dylan saw himself as the representative of anybody. And I think that was what attracted people to him, was that he really was an iconoclast. He was a universe unto himself, and I think that's what his gift was. The difference between Dylan and Trump is Trump believes in his following, and his following is propping him up. So it's a completely different kind of a situation. Are they both parallels?
Well, the whole question about heroism, what makes a hero and what makes an act or a behavior heroic, is itself in the crisis of transition that the rest of the culture and civilization are in. The idea of heroism up to now, still very much, and it's very ingrained in the American psyche, is a heroism that is enemy-oriented. You need to have a bad guy for me to exercise my good side upon and save this situation or this crisis. The heroism that I think we're talking about today is rather a self-oriented heroism, a heroism that is similar to what the founding fathers were advocating. It was a heroism in service to the other in a positive way and in service to the religious ideals that we carry and embody socially. To go from the egocentric to the self-oriented heroism is a huge, looks like a huge journey. And I think it's what makes it take centuries for it to take hold.
Don't we need an anti-heroic attitude if we're going to develop spiritually? Because narcissism is completely antithetical to any kind of spirituality. So the anti-heroic attitude requires spiritual surrender.
Yes, that's right.
What the traditions call letting go.
That's right.
And that's antithetical to many cultural ideals, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Because the ideal is has to do with victory and pride and nationalism. and those things are really incompatible with authentic spirituality.
Absolutely. I've just wrapped up a documentary in Africa called the Ubuntu documentary. And the first scene, which is actually happened, was a scene in which there was a basket of fruit put by a baobab tree. And the children were told the first one to get to the fruit gets all the fruit. And we know what would happen in the West. We know what would happen in Europe. There would be an all-out race to that basket. But the children huddled, and then they all held hands and they went to the basket together. That's anti-heroism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anti-individual.
It's either an anti-heroism or a very mature form of it.
Yeah, which goes to the core of the golden rule, which is unless everybody wins, nobody wins. And that's what we're not getting right now. And that's why malignant narcissism hopefully is reaching an apex and will die soon.
Yeah, well,
I don't think so, because, the neurosis of politicians gets incorporated into public policy. So the kind of people that want power are the kind of people that need to foster these traditional heroic values of nationalism and all that. I mean, it's kind of a disease. When
this is not at all a new issue.
No, it's an old issue.
It was there with the the authors of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And Thomas Jefferson, who of course was a very thoughtful, self-reflective man, said that the orientations of conservatism and liberalism itself are genetic. He didn't use that language, of course, but the idea behind it he conveyed very clearly. And he said there is no way to go about changing the people who are backward looking and fearful of the future and clutching onto dogma and the kind of mindset that these followers of Trump have. They behave almost as if they are in a hypnotic trance. Jefferson said there's no way to fight that directly because it's like you touch it and it's very sticky and you right away get trapped with it. The best way, he said, was to look within yourself. That's Thomas Jefferson 200 plus years ago. It's what the mystics were saying. So, and I think that is why the imagery and the archetype of the apocalypse comes up so much, particularly in the case of Bob Dylan, who's quite literal about what the apocalypse will bring. Because they're all right about one thing. It is so entrenched and so resistant to open exchange of ideas that, as Thomas Jefferson said, you got to treat it like an angry bull on the road and kind of walk around it. And I think that's the only way we're really going to get ahead, because until the belief in a literal second coming of Jesus gets transformed to a higher concept, that what is it that is really coming and what did Jesus himself symbolize? Until that dialogue goes on that level, we're all going to be at risk of, what Freud and Jung said about group psychology. We're going to sink to the lowest common denominator. So we have to kind of swim with the current that moves forward, and we just have to wait, for example, with these followers of Trump to sooner or later get sober. And it brings to mind what Lincoln said: you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but thank God not all of the people all the time. Those are the things that the new heroism has to deal with, but not in a way of fighting fire with fire, because that just makes more fire. We have to find a way that invites the self to manifest and be cultivated in youth. The fact that kids are going through elementary and high school and college now with no courses on civics, no courses on what we can learn from history, that's really frightening. because the cultural illiteracy leaves no choice but an apocalypse. So I think it's curious that all three of the great depth psychologists, Freud, Jung, and Adler, all eventually turned their attention to education. It is the collective form of psychotherapy. And in a sense, what we're doing here, we're having an educational sharing of ideas, and that moves things hopefully forward. These are, in some ways, the worst of times and also the best of times at the same time.
Michael, you're bringing up the whole reason for us being here together today, which is to generate conversations about important issues and to generate fecundity, the idea of the soil of the soul being stirred to make a difference. I really want to thank you, Michael, for coming to me with the idea. We talked about it as a myth salon. It's a bigger idea than a simple idea because it is a conversation.
For me, the gospel of Jung and depth psychology is that individuation is the motivating force of reality. And so long as I can carry that in my heart and mind, I have hope. And I think people are looking for hope in this current moment.
God, we are going to get into trouble if we use phrases like the Gospel of Jung, because a lot of seriously, a lot of Jungian.
I know.
They don't want, I agree with you because I'm on this. I feel that way as well. But a lot of people feel that they want their work to be a secular pursuit, and one of the original Freudian accusations about Jung was that he was turning psychology into a religion. That would be fine with me, but not with a lot of other people. So let's be careful about this.
The great definition of secularism is that not that it denies God, but that it ignores God.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, this is the beginning of the new conversation.
This is the beginning of something. Let's see what happens. But I really thank you, Michael, for writing the book. I mean, I am really impressed with your cultural knowledge of Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. I mean, you have a future as a musicologist. It's an example of how those characters really serve a larger issue. And this really makes for great material.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Dana. Brings to mind something Ezra Pound said, that the artist is the antenna of the race.
Yes. And Lionel, thank you very much for being who you are. You are just an indefatigable spirit. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll be in touch with you.